perfectly hear you. Yeah, we can perfectly hear you, John. The floor is
Oh,
yours.
you can. Thank you.
Definitely.
Sorry. I'm very frustrated not to be with you for all sorts of different reasons. I'm sad to miss the coffee break as well. A number of people in the audience I know, many I do not, and I would love to have had the conversations that would have resulted from being there. However, I'm under doctor's orders, I'm under antibiotics, and you really wouldn't want what I've had. So I'm doing it virtually. Thanks to the technical people for making that a possibility. And the theme I've been asked to address is the bioeconomy, buy, hold, or sell. But I'm going to use a more social and political than a financial version of that buy, hold, or sell. I don't know quite what's happening. When I'm pressing the transitions here, they worked before, but they're not. So let me just say, can I have the next transition, please? I'm not sure this is working. Hello? I can, yes, I can hear you. I've been doing that. We did it in the test, it worked. I'm doing it now again, and it's not working. Okay. My apologies to everyone in the audience for this. Can you see that? Well, let's just see if it works now. It works, good. Thank you. Bioeconomy, buy, hold, or sell, a social and political perspective rather than a financial one. And I just wanted to add my best wishes to BIC, to the consortium at this critical time in its own evolution. I heard Dick say from the stage that it was quite something to survive. Having been through a number of startup situations, I know that to be true. Volans, Philip kindly referenced, founded in 2008. People in the team came from different directions. We were the first B Corporation in the UK and incubated B Lab UK for 9 months ahead of their finding their feet. Worked for a range of different people around the world and help business regenerate. So that's enough background. Let me just say about the theme that I'm going to address. I'm going to talk about buy and hold, but I'm also going to talk about switch. I'll explain just in a moment what I mean by that. So I've been 50 years now in the environmental and then sustainability space. It started off in some ways with my refusal at school to cut up a living frog, which you then had to do as part of your biology lessons. Because of that, I couldn't study science at school. And many years later, I came back to science through a magazine called New Scientist, which I wrote for a number of years in the 1970s. And because of that, was asked to edit a biotechnology newsletter, which I did for 15 years, more or less as a hobby. But one part of that story was a book I did back in 1985 called The Gene Factory. And it was based on visits to about 60 or 70 companies around the world involved in genetic engineering and biotechnology. And what was interesting, and this was the 1980s, was that then many companies, Biogen, Cetus, Genentech, all of these different companies were talking about energy and waste and renewable resources and environmental applications of their technologies. But most of that blew away in the wind. It came down to AIDS and cancer and so on. But I think we're getting back into that really important space, and not before time. I raised funds for the World Wildlife Fund in its first year when I was 11. That was 1961. And I've been involved ever since. I'm on their Council of Ambassadors. But if you look at what's happened since 1970, and most people in the audience will be well aware of this, it's been catastrophic, the loss of wildlife around the world. And what's particularly remarkable, if you then look at mammals, and you look at the proportion of the world's mammals that are now either human or human-owned or operated versus wildlife, you'll see that only 4% of mammals are now wild and in nature. That's the reality that we've created. That's the reality that we've now got to cope with. And I think the reality that we can actually overcome if we have enough political will. So when I talk about a switch in all of this, I'm talking about that in terms that Janine Benyus uses. Some of you, I hope many of you will be aware of her work on biomimicry with Biomimicry 3.8. And the point she makes is that it's one thing learning about the natural world in science or whatever. It's quite a different thing to learn how to do things that you need to do by studying how the natural world does that. And then there's another level of all of this, and that is this question of to what extent can any area of science and technology and industry be in service of life, which is something that, again, that Janine has underscored quite substantially. I just want to say a few things around paradigms. I read a book back in 1962, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It talked about paradigm shifts the first time. And it was really quite shocking because it suggested that, at least shocking to me, it suggested that paradigms take about 70 to 80 years to shift. If that's true, Rachel Carson, James Lovelock, people like that back in the late 50s, early 60s, they've triggered a paradigm which I think is now just now starting to put its claws in and become accepted reality. And in the world in which we operate, which is pretty much corporate boards and C-suites around the world, all of this is becoming progressively the reality in which people operate. Many of them then default to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, beautifully colorful. But unfortunately, we're halfway through the delivery timescale, and it's extremely unlikely now that we will deliver against most of them. And I was in the New York during Climate Week, and I think increasingly that is a growing concern. And then on top of that, you have things like COVID-19. And one of the things I've noticed in boardrooms since 2020 is that board level decision makers are now increasingly aware that there are systemic crises building up all around us. COVID-19 was one of those. There are many others out there. And increasingly younger people see this, they sense this, they're out in the streets protesting. And they're calling not just for incremental change, increasingly they're calling for systemic change. And one of the things I've heard from director level people in business is that their own children are beating them up at the breakfast table, basically saying, when did you decide to become an eco-criminal? And at the same time, you've got groups like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We helped them refresh their Vision 2050 a couple of years back. And they're starting to use phrases like system change, like transformation as well. So at least that's some form of progress if language was enough to change the world. But unfortunately, as we all know, it's not. All around us, things are starting to behave in very unexpected ways. There's a lot of concern in Europe at the moment about migration. That's the very beginning of a problem that will build in coming decades. There's concern around the conflict in Ukraine, and again, there should be, but again, pressures are coming on that are putting into the spotlight a range of issues that have been clustered under the sustainability agenda for a very long time, but are starting to become, again, painful reality. But the financial markets are, let's put it politely, dozing, if not fully asleep. This was Stuart Kirk, an analyst at HSBC, who lost his job because of this particular statement that he made. I won't read it out, but I mean, it did us a service because it was a reminder that capital markets as yet do not properly understand or care for or value the sorts of things that I think future generations will increasingly be concerned about. And this is the world in which we increasingly live. Many of you will have seen diagrams like this from people like Singularity University. Periods of time where very little seems to happen, and then the paradigm does shift, and it goes in it moves very, very quickly indeed. As I said, I've been 50 years professionally in this space, and I think I'm going to see more, or we're going to see more change in the next 15 years than in the last 50. And as a result of all of that, the agenda is becoming very much more political. But before I talk about that, the way in which the sustainability agenda is now starting to mainstream is perhaps symbolized, at least to me, by the fact that Mattel has done 4 dolls which illustrate 4 different roles that young women can now move into. In the pink on the left, a chief sustainability officer, but there are huge numbers of those now in different parts of the world. Wildlife specialists, protesters, renewable energy specialists, and so on. So that's the good news. The rather less good news is that the pushback has begun. People with vested interests, sunk assets, and so on are starting to wake up to the fact that this is real. It's coming at them hard and fast, and it could cost them a great deal of money. So what are they doing? They're pushing back. One of the people who was early to experience that pushback was Larry Fink at BlackRock. States like Texas, Louisiana, Florida, starting to delist some or stop using some of the services that BlackRock use. That's not going to get any better in my view. You've had some positive results on the political side. For example, Scott Morrison, shown on the left, brandished that lump of coal in the Australian Parliament, saying that was the future. Well, no, it isn't. He was voted out of office by Tony Albanese, or in favor of Tony Albanese. And you've had a similar outcome in Brazil, where Bolsonaro was thrown out in favor of Lula, and Amazonia is already starting to show some of the benefits of that. But at the same time, you've got deeper trends at work, and I think we've seen growing concern about the propensity of China to throw its weight around things like rare earth minerals. And I was once in Japan when China cut off rare earth minerals for a week, and in Japan's just-in-time economy, that had a huge impact. So no surprise in a way that the US, with its Inflation Reduction Act, is trying to step up and address these sorts of strategic and competitive challenges. And I really wish I was with you to hear Mary Maxon's presentation later on, because I think what the US is doing in this space is extremely interesting, including on the bioeconomy front. Just towards a conclusion, one of the things I've talked about since 2020 is the notion of green swans, also picked up by the Bank of International Settlements. My version of the theme is exponential solutions to the sorts of challenges that are identified by the Sustainable Development Goals. In the Bank of International Settlements, they're only talking about climate change challenges. But the sorts of trajectories, which I think could be described fairly as green swans, would include what's happening on a range of different energy technologies, including batteries, their price points absolutely plummeting. And if you haven't come across the work of Rethink X, based in the UK and in Silicon Valley, I cannot recommend their work highly enough on the economic, but also the social and environmental implications of some of these exponential technologies. And one of those is synthetic biology, including things like precision fermentation. Very, very exciting work going on in that space. Some early work around things like Impossible Burgers and so on, stumbling a bit. And I heard in the earlier panel discussions some talk around the importance of trust. Well, your whole sector of bio-based solutions is going to be absolutely electrifyingly exciting in the next 10 years. But when you start to think about things like gene drives and the potential for bioterrorism and so on, the society's broader trust in what you're doing, or what they think they see you doing, is going to be challenged, I think, fairly continuously. And that is something we all need to get ahead of, because I think your approaches, your technologies, your models are so fundamentally important. One of the reasons for that is that they all play into the emerging agenda around regeneration. It's interesting, isn't it, that again in 2020, Walmart, the world's biggest retailer at the time, declared that it was going to become a regenerative company. Well, you can believe what you like, but I choose to believe that Doug McMillon, as CEO, meant what he said. And we've started to see some initiatives happening within that giant company, cascading through its supply chains, which I think are really quite exciting. And the diagram on the right just gives you a sense of where the language is going. People are starting to move from the sustainability definition, which they have, I think, redefined as less bad. It was never simply that, towards regeneration. And I think the challenge now, whether you use sustainability or regeneration or both, the challenge now is for the bio-based solutions sector to play very strongly and clearly into this new space. And it's not what business is doing only. Cities are also starting to play into this space. For example, in the US, I work with the Smart Surfaces Coalition, which is working how you cool down cities by bringing plant cover, green roofs, urban trees, all of these things back into cities. So a final slide, or penultimate slide at least. My conclusion would be that we should all buy and hold stocks or interests or whatever it is in the bio-based industries sector. But we should ask ourselves, how do we move from bio-based to Janine Benyus's formulation of in service of life, and not just human life, but all life? And how in the process can the bio-based sector become the #1 sector, let's say, in regeneration, and not just the EU doing it on its own. It's very tempting to talk about this as strategic and competitive, but increasingly we're going to have to do this together. And at that point, Philip, if I may, I'll hand back to you. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, John, for your valuable insights. And let me just add this: the bio-based industries sector is a natural partner for those driving the sustainable or the sustainability transition, but we really have to answer the questions as a sector and as a company. Do we have a sufficiently powerful voice and a clear enough agenda when it comes to sustainability? And that is perhaps extra food for thought. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, what burning questions do you have for John? We all know that life is filled with so many unanswered questions, but luckily, John may have some of the answers. So we have a mobile microphone prepared for you. If you have a question for John, please just raise your hand or just stand up. Any one of you? John, if you allow me to ask you a question, has there been an assessment of the impact of bio-based solutions in addressing the UN Sustainable Development Goals, especially considering the current concerns about the goals potentially falling short of their intended impact? What do you think in that respect?
As far as I know, there has not been a comprehensive survey of bio-based solutions, but people in the audience may know differently. It's one of the things when I first came across your consortium that I asked myself, because I believe that over the next 10 to 15 years, the sorts of solutions that are represented in the room, and I understand that many of the organizations that are members of BIC are SMEs. Nonetheless, it's true that much innovation comes from smaller enterprises. So I think if it hasn't been done, and I'm not asserting that it hasn't, but if it has not been done, I think something like that within the next year to 18 months would be valuable in two ways. One is because I absolutely believe that the 20th century chemical and oil-based and so on technologies that we've used to drive solutions to our big challenges to date simply will not solve tomorrow's challenges. We need very different types of technology. Some of those will be in areas like artificial intelligence, others will be in synthetic biology, and some of them will just be in conventional biological and ecological science and technology. So my email is john@volans.com. If anyone knows of such a study, I'd be really keen to know about it and will do my best to promote it. If you don't know, or it's hard to prove a negative, but I wonder whether BIC might consider doing something like that, perhaps globally, not just on an EU basis. Back to you, Philip.
Okay. Could you just repeat your email address again, John?
Yes, it's John, John, @volans, volans.com.
All right, thank you so much. John, I wish you the very best with your health. Ladies and gentlemen, please give him a warm applause. John Elkington.